Hello, everyone. Welcome to Textile Talks. I'm Sarah Walcott, Artist B. James, Curator of Collections at the International Quilt Museum. We are located at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. The International Quilt Museum proudly stewards and exhibits the world's largest collection of quilts and related textiles that span 5 centuries and over 65 countries. In fact, that is our mission and our passion, to build a global collection and audience that celebrates the cultural and artistic significance of quilts. If this is your passion too, and you aren't already a member, we'd love to have you join us. Before we begin, I want to recognize and thank the organizations that partner with the IQM to bring you Textile Talks each week: Quilt Alliance, SAQA, and the Surface Design Association. We're honored to bring you free and inspiring programming with the help of our sponsors. We couldn't do it without their generosity and the generosity of viewers like you. Just a couple housekeeping reminders before I introduce our program. Please put all of your questions in the Q&A and use the chat box for greeting others and the survey for commentary or ways we can improve. If you prefer not to see notifications from the chat, you can click on the chat button to toggle them on or off. The live captions make Textile Talks accessible to a wider audience. If you prefer not to view captions, you should be able to turn them off as well. And just make a note of next week's talk. It's going to be great. Wednesday, March 19th at 2 p.m. Eastern, Quilters Save Our Stories interview with Dr. Carolyn L. Mazlumi, presented by Quilt Alliance. That will be amazing. Can't wait to tune in for that one. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you again to our sponsors and for all of you who support this programming. I'm so thrilled to welcome two incredible textile artists to our conversation today, Heidi Parks and Zach Foster. Heidi is a true storyteller with fabric, known for her deeply personal and evocative quilts that blend traditional techniques with a fresh, modern perspective. From her beautiful hand-stitched works to her commitment to teaching and sharing the art of diary quilting, Heidi's practice is a beautiful reflection of memory, process, and care. Her latest exhibition, Soft Magic, is currently on view at the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Arts, showcasing not just her work, but the relationships that shape her as an artist. Zach has a gift for making quilts feel alive with history and meaning. His improvisational style and use of reclaimed fabrics tell stories that are both intimate and universal. Whether he's creating memory quilts, exploring the concept of a new apocalypse, or collaborating on award-winning works, his approach is rooted in tradition while pushing the boundaries of what quilting can be. Both Heidi and Zach bring such heart and vision to their work, and I can't wait to dive into this conversation with them today. Welcome, Heidi and Zach.
Thank you so much for having us, Sarah.
Ooh, well, welcome, Sarah. Hi, Heidi.
It's so good to see you. I just saw you recently.
I'm telling you, and it's good to see you in your normal abode. I am here in Pinland in Western North Carolina. Shout out to Textile Studios. Thank you for joining. Where we're still experiencing like the unraveling of Hurricane Helene and trying to ravel things back together, which means I'm in a special Zoom room, which is an empty dorm room, not my normal location, but feels good to be at Pinland nonetheless. So I'm so happy that we can make this work.
And I'm here from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I love seeing in the chat people who are here from Evanston, Illinois, Chicago, Milwaukee, Minnesota, Iowa. Many of you are driving distance to come see Soft Magic. So Lucy, thank you for putting the link for the Soft Magic exhibition in. And then Zach, if you want to take it away with our slideshow, we can start sharing about our recent collaborative quilt. Yes, more, please.
Let's go there. Some of y'all might have seen this at QuiltCon. If you didn't, here's a short little reel that I made and then never shared, but it'll give you a really good sense of how people were greeted when they walked into QuiltCon in Phoenix just a couple weeks ago. Come on now. Well, you get the idea. Yeah, maybe the video wasn't quite working. Wi-Fi, what you gonna do? The story, though, starts with Heidi. I'd like you to set us up if you don't mind, because you were so much more eloquent when we were standing at the quilt telling people about the origin story for Yes More, please. And then maybe I could talk a little more about the process side.
Absolutely. So The Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Arts has an annual rummage, usually around Father's Day, and it is the place to be in Wisconsin and the Midwest. And so when the invites to, and you can go back to that slide you were on, when the invites to volunteer for the rummage went out, Zach signed up immediately, no questions asked, just
I didn't
checked
even check with
crash at
you.
my place. And we carved out some time to make a quilt together. And I had previously purchased this baby quilt with the giraffes at the rummage. So it felt like an auspicious, special starting place for our quilt. And what you can see that we knew for sure was going to happen was this idea of Yes, More Please, made with a print by Jennifer Sampu. And I love a calendar and tracking time. And so here, all these little squares laid out are the moon phases for the waxing moon and the waning moon from the time that Zach bought his plane ticket the day he RSVP'd to volunteer to the time that we were there together in person working on this quilt. Interestingly, and you can go to the next slide, the baby quilt ended up being very thick to quilt through, super challenging to work with. So we ended up scrapping that and going for a base fabric in black. And you can see how we've got one piece of base fabric and we're playing around a lot. The Yes, More Please evolved. And Zach's going to share more about the process, but this idea of Yes, More Please was one that deeply resonated with both of us. And we weren't always professional quilters. In fact, we were both high school teachers for a long time. I taught art and Zach taught Spanish. And we are so excited to be living a self-led life and being self-employed. There are challenges that come with self-employment, but we routinely get together and cheer each other on through those challenges and continue to feel that the rewards of this life outweigh the things that are challenging about it. And we were both really overcome with gratitude for reaching a place where our careers felt more sustainable instead of the scrappy struggle when you're first getting started. And we wanted to send out a wish into the universe to say, thank you, yes, more please. We want more of this life. And counterintuitively, we realized that we had been talking for at least the last year far more about the word no than about the word yes. We were cheering each other on every single time we said no to something. No, I can't collaborate. No, I can't work for that amount of money. No, I don't have time to do something for free for exposure. No, 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 no. And what we really strongly felt was that all those no's were in service of a great big yes. And that if you're not holding that big yes strong and powerful in your heart with the goal, with your eye on the prize of what you do want, it can get picked apart and stolen away from you through a million little tiny yeses instead of those nos. And so that's how we came to yes, more please. And you notice this exclamation point and how it grows and grows as Zach works on it. But over to you, Zach.
Yeah, oh, thank you for flagging that exclamation point. I'm in the middle of reading 4,000 Weeks, which Heidi, I know you've read before.
Mhm.
And to this point of saying no to say yes, the premise of 4,000 Weeks, the lifespan of the average human, is that we are mortals, we are finite, we cannot say yes to everything. So that when we do say yes, it is supported by all the no's that we've had to turn down, right? So we say yes because it's a thing of value that we're choosing, but it's also value because we had to say no to some things that might also have been fun too, right? So I'll just also, if you're flagging the exclamation point, I'm going to flag these two giraffes here on the original baby quilt that we didn't end up using. We had some help, Penelope, this is your brother-in-law's dog, is that right, Heidi?
My niece, yeah.
Your niece. So Penelope, big helper. Her name did not make the credits, but we love her. Look at this. Couldn't have done it without her. We worked for about 3 or 4 days together in Milwaukee, but there came a point where I had to split, go back to Brooklyn where I was living at the time. So we cut it down the middle. And you can see Heidi's side on the left, and you can see my side hanging up already on my design wall on the right. So this is what we finished up independently of one another. I'll also just point out, you see that on the right-hand side of your screen? Ah, there we go, a little blue pointer. You see this Victorian Crazy Quilt block? Got that at the Wisconsin Rummage Sale for a quarter, and it plays an integral part into the design of this quilt. So here we are working separately. I'm on the plane ride back to New York. Heidi's back in Milwaukee. And this is the quilt that was born out of it. When she finished her right-hand side, she mailed it to me. I sutured them all together, and that's what you see here before you. I was hard pressed, Heidi, when we were at QuiltCon to figure out where exactly our cut line was. So I was actually pretty happy to see this picture again as a reminder. We did a good job.
I was appreciating that now too, because that was such a big part of the story, and it was very hard to remember exactly where that seam was.
Exactly, exactly. So just a couple of special details in the last couple minutes that we're going to spend here on this. Heidi, I'll let you talk about the animal familiars. This was your ad.
Yeah, so I've been researching a lot into self-inquiry with my practice of diary quilting, and I started to learn about animal familiars and that the idea that there might be an animal that feels similar to your personality. And I've found that the more I learn about rabbits, the more I learn about myself. And I really love that. And Zach's animal that he feels connected to is the deer. So now when I see deer, I film them and I send them to Zach. And I wanted to put this deer nestled and relaxing in the yoke of that Y with a little ribbon, that lace banner above. And yeah, they just are very meaningful. And then in terms of the giraffe, it's such a poetic animal because they've got that bird's eye view. They can see the zoomed out scope of things. And that's what we were really trying to tackle with this idea of always remembering the big yes and not getting in the weeds with the small yeses.
Inspiration from the original baby quilt that we ended up not using. There's some really nice details here. I just wanted to give you these textures so you can soak them in. I think the biggest compliment I got, Heidi, or the thing the observation I was the most fascinated by was by the folks at QuiltCon walking around in the white gloves saying, of all the quilts here, you and Heidi's quilt is the one we have to keep like stepping in and intervening because people want to touch it. And so if I could just say one thing quilter to quilter, it's that texture has some kind of magic, right? Color has a magic. It draws us across the room, but then texture is what makes the physical connection. It's what draws your hand to the piece. And I feel like there's something there. There's a technology there that we can work with as quilters. On the left-hand side, you see a little piece of road construction reflector. That was a big joke of you remember how much road construction is being done in Milwaukee, Heidi, when I was visiting. So I sewed that on without her knowing it. I tried to copy her style with the moons. I did some of those, stitches on the circles.
Mhm.
And then here's that Victorian crazy quilt block that I got for a quarter. Just so happened to be the same quarter, the same size. Shame, the video's not loading here. Oh, but there it is. Now you can see it in the bottom right-hand corner. Once I saw that, I'm like, I got a point for my explanation. And you can see that it grew, 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 which just felt more appropriate. We had run out of the Jennifer Shampoo fabric, so I got to make my own print, which is a lot of fun. And if you've never done it, highly recommend. Just by sewing down, and you can see a detail here on the left-hand side, sewing down red dashes on top of orange fabric. And there we go. Yes, more please. Heidi, you got any concluding thoughts as we wrap this section up?
Just, a huge thank you to Allison Glass for giving us a Judge's Choice Award. A giant thank you to Wonderful, who so generously gave both of us a huge set of rainbow colored thread. They were prepared to give one set because usually it goes to one person, but we were collaborators. And so they were just so generous with that. There's a question in the chat about the QuiltCon label, and one person submits the quilt. So it was me submitting to QuiltCon, and that's why it was on the label that way. But they did have his name below, just not his Instagram account. And it's just,
Well, technically, I think it said additional handwork by, but we're gonna
yeah.
I
And,
worded that.
that's how the the form, there's always some issues with the form. So if you want the
Yeah,
form to be different, maybe add that in the review. I need to do my review before the expiration date closes. But it was wonderful to see the recent textile talk with about QuiltCon and unpacking some of the history of QuiltCon. And I'm just overjoyed that I finally was able to submit a quilt and encourage Zach to attend for the first time and have a quilt in the show for the first time. And just a huge thank you to all of the judges. I never dreamed that this quilt would get best hand quilting because it's an unprecedented kind of hand quilting to receive that award. And I think it's, you know, a small step for us and a big step for quilter kind, that this type of hand quilting with exposed knots and big stitches and varying amounts of density across the quilt was able to receive this award. So we just feel tremendously grateful and excited.
absolutely. And as I think this was a really pivotal piece for me in my personal practice, Heidi, because I
Mm.
became this is one of those projects where it's like, oh, I like it, I like it, I like it, I like it, I like it. I don't know if I like it. Let me try this. Wait, I love it. Right. And like it was this like maximalist explosion that just finally like settled into place. And so I think you'll see a lot when I share here in a minute with my newer work that really has roots in Yes More Please.
Mm.
Shall we hop
And
on over?
onward to that. Yeah.
Okay, let's go. Setting my timer. Trying to keep on track here, folks. All right. So I would really like to share with y'all two bodies of work. One I call Southern White Amnesia, one I call The New Apocalypse. Southern White Amnesia is much more filled out, and New Apocalypse is a burgeoning collection. I find it, I noted in myself that it's so interesting that I have one collection that looks backwards into the past, and then I started this other collection that looks forward into the future. And it felt very disjointed for the first few pieces, but the more I think about it, the more sense it makes, right? Like I am studying what compels me to learn more about the past is so that we can reckon with it, we can understand it, we can make amends if necessary, and then we can pivot and look forward to a more equitable and just future that is free from the trauma and the hangups and the baggage of the past. In fact, a lot of these pieces that you're about to see are in a common show together that we're calling Memory Forward, the idea of using memory to instruct where we're going. And so I believe there's a lot of tie in here. I want to introduce you to some of the folks who I come from. This is, you see on the right, my grandma who passed away just a couple years ago at age 107. Here she is at the age of 16, 17. They had just come back from Rio de Janeiro. Her mother, my great grandmother, was a quilter. I never knew her, but I did inherit this quilt from her. And it is a Marie Webster pattern. Thank you, Roderick, for teaching me that. Marie Webster pattern with the most poetic name, Windblown Tulips. And I love it. It's in perfect condition. Thank you, Faux was her name for this quilt. Now, Southern White Amnesia had its crystallization moment when I got to meet Dr. Carolyn Mazlumi. And it's so fortuitous that she's going to be here in this same virtual chair next week. And it'll be interesting to see how these conversations interweave with one another. But we had the great good fortune of meeting up at International Quilt Museum in November of 2023. I'd been invited to speak. She was opening a show of some of her collected works. We all went out to dinner afterwards and had a gay old time. And it was in her collection, as we were walking around the gallery that night, where I saw that so many of the quilts that she had collected that were resonating most deeply with me were the ones where the quilters were telling hyper-specific personal stories with so much detail and texture that they almost became universal again, right? I am not a person of color. I was not alive in the 60s. I never participated in a sit-in at a Woolworths counter. But because of those textural personal details, it felt real. And because it felt real, I could then make connections to my own life and my own stories that fleshed it out, right? So, pivotal moment. The first quilt I made in this series And sorry if that's a little pixelated on the left. This was the catalyst moment. This was a little piece of poetry that rumbled around my head until I had to get it out into fabric. And that is, I am the family historian in my family. And oddly enough, it's interesting how many queer people are the family historians, the guardians of tradition. By no means only queer people, but a lot of us. And when I first started researching my family history and I first found the records that my ancestors had enslaved people, this is something I never heard of before. So what do? I immediately go to one of my relatives who should know these things. And I said, is it true? Did we enslave people? And she said, no, real fast. I think we would know. And that just blew the lid off of everything for me. Because I wondered in that moment how many other white Southern folks, and not just Southern folks, we could just say white folks, are walking around wondering, assuming that they would know. But have we done the work to know? This is what's so interesting to me about this Sunbonnet Sue and overall Sam pattern. I've never seen it the same way since, right? Because here we have two figures that are actively not facing the situation. They're not facing us, right? We don't see their faces. They are not in search of truth. They're looking off in some other direction. So I took this moo of sorts, quilted these words, there you go, on top of Sunbonnet Sue. I don't know exactly what's going to happen. This piece is just the first, and it memorialized that spark of ignition. Now, I feel relatively confident, are probably familiar with Jessie Telfair's iconic Freedom Quilt. She made 4 of these starting in the 70s. I had long thought that they were testaments to democracy, right? That they were like songs in praise of America. And then I learned what actually happened. And that was that in 1963, Jessie Telfair, a Black woman working in a cafeteria in Parrott, Georgia, went to register to vote, as was her democratically given right. And her white boss promptly fired her, which then she was still so torn up about it, stirred up about it a decade later. When she was at a SNCC meeting, they encouraged her to make a quilt with all this energy that she had been carrying around for a decade, and freedom came out of it, right? This gets me thinking, well, we've seen pictures of Jessie Telfair's kids, grandkids, great grandkids with her quilts in some of the country's best museums. She created a legacy that continues to expand and bless as it moves into the future. What about the white guy that fired her? What do his descendants know about his role in this shared moment? That's what I got really interested in. So I created this two-sided quilt. It's called, and it's just an homage. It is an ode to her legacy, what she set up for herself and for her children in making these quilts. But the backside, oh, there's some details for you. Feast, feast. We love the little textural details. The backside, though, is much quieter, almost ghostly, kind of haunting. We see freedom written in the inverse from the front. And this to me speaks of what do the descendants of the white man who fired her know about their ancestors' role in history. So this for me is a case study of how this there can be a singular historical event, and it might travel differently in different families for different motivations, right? We all carry these motivations for either telling stories or hiding stories, and I'm interested really in the ones that we hide. All right, who knows what that slide was? Silver dollar. This is a great example of the kinds of stories that don't get told. Hold on, there we go. All right, so what you see here is one way to show a family tree, right? Like we're used to the tree format. This is called the fan view. And so you can see me in the bottom left-hand corner, and it goes back in history as the fan expands up and to the right. And what we see here are all of my grandparents, and great-grandparents. The green ribbon down the middle, if you could read it, says slave owners forced to emancipate. So that gives you kind of a line in the sand of where we are in history. Now, if we weren't crunched for time, and if you and I were standing in front of this piece, I wouldn't tell you any of this because I think it's all there. But if you'll indulge me, what I was interested in overlaying was the branches of my family that engaged in the practice of slavery and overlaid with the branches of my family that had access to higher education. So the pink denotes the access, the engagement in slavery. The blue represents access to higher education. And you can see here how it goes nearly hand in hand in my family, right? Folks on my mom's side had access to higher education, which of course leads to many other things, right? Social networks, wealth, opportunities, all kinds of stuff. On my mom's side, you can see that access. On my dad's side, you can see first generation college student right here. He came from a long line of subsistence farmers. So I feel like my family's a really interesting case study for how this American experiment's working. We've been here, both main branches of my tree, been here for 400 years. So I feel like I can speak with a slice of authority on this. Also, just to be vulnerable, here I am down here in the bottom left corner. I've also had access to higher education, right? And it's a relatively new phenomenon in my family, at least on my dad's side, which means I also am swimming in the same river of access that's been passed down in my family.
Zach, we want to make sure we see the other half of your presentation where
Oh,
we're
Heidi, you're such a good friend. Okay, so listen, y'all, I can tell stories all day. Like family, it's a reconstruction of a family burial ground where all my family was buried inside with relatively nice carved tombstones. But then there were sunken graves on the outside of the wall, which the person who was guiding me said that's probably where they buried their enslaved folks. And so this is a meditation on how white folks and folks in power often gatekeep even in the afterlife, which is a bonkers idea, but we do it. Family bed is a series of dolls. I made 35 dolls, one for each ancestor that enslaved people. And then there's me. More, I like the one on the right better. The hot pink dude, he's doing something else these days. But I love this idea that like we can't shake our family tree. Whether you know your family history or not, we are our ancestors. So in a sense, here in the present tense, I'm still in this big, awkward family bed with all of my ancestors who engaged in slavery. I'm trying to make it work. And then to wrap up this portion of my time, uh, an ongoing project. I'm just calling it reparations quilt. Maybe I'll get more clever one of these days. But I saw this on eBay late one night. And here you're seeing actual screenshots. And I fell in love with the patterns of abrasion and wear that had happened over time. And it kindled in me, as it's probably kindled in you, something similar at other times. As quilters, we often see old quilts like this, and we feel this desire to repair and to make right. We feel that this is an injustice to someone's hard work. And what I would like to do with the Reparations Quilt Project is to go through mending it. And you can see here on the right that I'm kind of, and on the left, that I'm doing some kind of like lacy-like mending, not fixing it, not covering it up, just tending to it, tending to the wear and the tear that's happened over time. And I want to draw a parallel for us between the feeling that we so often feel when we see an old raggedy quilt and the feeling that sometimes is absent when we look across society and see things that are in need of repair as well. Oftentimes people are like, not my problem. It's been a long time. My ancestors didn't enslave people, right? But we don't think that way about quilts. We just love quilts and we wanted to fix it. So that's what I'm thinking about as I'm stitching on this quilt. Now, switching gears, we're going to go to the future. We're going to think about the new apocalypse. I noticed this within me about a year ago when the Southeastern Quilt and Textile Museum reached out to me. And they're like, Zach, we want to do a show for you in 2025. And I said, y'all cute. You think we're still going to be here? And I'm like, whoa, Zach, you're a doomsdayer and you didn't even know it. I wondered how many other people feel that the world is falling apart. Chances are pretty good. And so I wanted to explore these stories about why do we, like moths to a flame, draw ourselves to stories of disaster and catastrophe when we could be telling ourselves other stories, stories about the time we finally got it right. So here was the first piece I made in this collection. Collapse we thought was certain was
Oh, poor Zach's frozen longer than I thought he'd be. So collapse we thought was certain. From my recollection of him sharing about it on Instagram, and he can catch us up when he unfreezes, was about the idea of what if it's not certain, and what if things could turn around or be wildly different. And so it's confronting some of that strong neural pathway that's set on collapse and pivoting. We lost Zach's PowerPoint. Yeah, we might be losing Zach. So how about I'll share and then Zach can pick up again from there.
Perfect. That sounds great, Heidi. Thank you.
Yeah. And neural pathways sure are the, the thing that I get excited about. So this is a great point to shift over. I am excited to share about Soft Magic. This is the exhibition that I have right now at the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Art up through June 8th. And so here's the gallery space, and you can see that Yes, More Please is on view, as well as a quilt that at QuiltCon got Judge's Choice from Tammy Rubin and was second place in improv. And this quilt back here, that one was at QuiltCon also. The other exciting quilt to point out, and I'm so delighted to see that he's here in the audience live, is Roderick Kirikoff is here in the audience, and he's done an awesome textile talk in the past as well. And this is a quilt that is in his collection at the International Quilt Museum. And we were so lucky that it was personally delivered from Nebraska to Wisconsin to be in this show. So there are many treasures, and there are quilts that are by me, but also quilts that are by other people in the show. And this is a view at some of the quilts that are in Soft Magic. All of these are so far. And I just find that a video can be such a delicious way to start to see the texture and understand some of the things that are going on in the quilt. So here I'm in my artist in residence studio at the Pfister Hotel in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I got to enjoy being there for 13 months, all of 2024 and also January 25. And I was very lucky that my friend Nicola Muscroft came and filmed this beautiful footage of me in the studio. You see this video right now is highlighting some of the calendars that I like to have in my work. I also worked with a lot of other art mediums before becoming a quilter. I was a high school art teacher. My first love was ceramics. I did a lot of painting and a fair amount of embroidery. And then that got me into quilting, and the portability of quilting is one of my favorite aspects. I can be just about anywhere and also working on a quilt. So those tally marks I did in a lecture that I was attending at the Milwaukee Art Museum, that applique I did on an airplane and on a car ride. And here I am enjoying the beautiful view of Lake Michigan from the Pfister Hotel. Zach, I see you just logged in. I'm taking over, but then we're going to have you come back with the new apocalypse to close it down. So it's
Okay, so what was the last thing you heard, just so I know where to
I'm
hop
like the
back?
filling in your donut. It was just the new apocalypse.
Okay,
So
got it.
you had the collapse we thought was certain is where you were.
Ooh, I gave myself a real good presentation. I didn't know. Okay.
Oh, you were just all alone.
Yeah, I was just
Oh.
talking. Okay, carry
Well,
on,
you
Heidi. Thank you.
practiced. You're going to be so succinct when you come back. So this is my home studio, and I am just delighted to be back in my home studio. You might have noticed that that was a rabbit-shaped scissors, which is a real important detail for me because you know already now how I love rabbits. So this is a little video, and I've got quite a few real shaped videos for the rest of this presentation rather than horizontal style, unfortunately. But this was my studio at the Pfister, and it was a very helpful residency for honing that ability to say yes and to say no. When you have a studio that's open to the public and you're there 30 hours a week minimum, there's just a lot to negotiate and a lot of opportunities to practice. One of the things that I loved the most about the residency, and I'm going to be sharing about this on Zach's podcast, Seamside. He did an intro interview and an outro interview for me when I was the artist in residence. And I shared about the way that I became more succinct talking about my work and what a pleasure it was to see people look at my quilts and discover what they connected to or what they were curious about, what they saw and what they didn't see. And so I started to realize that while the calendar has become a near ubiquitous part of my work, it is not something that people recognize without the numbers and the other details. And so it's important for me to say that the calendar is there, as well as to unpack some of the intricacies of how things have been sewn and some of the other symbolism that I have going on with the abstraction that I'm using. This is then a view into the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Arts. So that quilt I worked on furiously for about a month and a half and had it done just in the nick of time to go on the wall in the exhibition space. And this is a real special peek at what the Soft Magic show looks like. The opening reception is this Saturday, the 15th, National Quilting Day. So I'm trying to leave a few secrets, especially for the artists who have their quilts on display besides myself. But it's so special to get to share that space and what it looks like. And I wanted to unpack for you with words, especially because I've learned so much about what is intuitive and isn't intuitive to understand about it here. So I like to work with a process that I call a diary quilt. And when I think about a diary, I think about the past, the present, and the future. And that shows up partly in cognitive reframing. That's something that I do with my therapist a lot. And there's a neural pathway, there's a story that I'm telling myself about how things are and how they got there and how they're going to be in the future based on past experience. And cognitive reframing is the ability to tell yourself a new story about the way things are. And hopefully it is a truer, more honest, more helpful story. And there's so much about Zach's work that gets into that idea as well. And then the present connects to daily minutia. I, in college, took a class from Ann Wilson, who has work in this exhibition. And her class was called Art and the Everyday at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And she had us looking at receipts and trimming our fingernails and all of the everyday, ordinary, boring things. And sometimes a diary, especially in the UK, they call their agenda, their calendar, a diary. And I really love that aspect of it, the way that I can look back in my calendar and figure out what I did that day in the most boring and ordinary of ways. And then the future can be oriented towards manifesting the law of attraction, setting goals, thinking about what I want, and preparing myself to see those doors opening. If I'm expecting collapse, I'm going to see evidence of that everywhere. But if I'm expecting possibility, I'm going to see evidence of that everywhere. So it's not so wild and woo-woo, but in fact, really rooted in neural science around how you can cultivate habits and ways of seeing and what you're expecting to look at. And you don't want to be so far that you have rose-colored glasses and you think everything's just fine right now. But there's a way of looking to the future in a diary quilt. And even back in childhood, I would set goals or like think about what I wanted to do in the future, what my favorite things to eat were, what would I smell when I was on vacation is one of my really cute diary entries. So manifesting and looking to the future. I also do a lot of creating privacy through abstraction. A diary often is a very private space, and I don't want to be oversharing. There's a fine line that Brene Brown speaks about really beautifully with her work on vulnerability, and then being beyond vulnerable and oversharing. And so the abstraction helps me stay within that healthy realm. Sometimes diary quilts are connected to intuition, convenience. What can I sew when I'm on the airplane? Where do I have time to sew? Who am I with? And just whims, things that I think, gosh, I'm really in the mood for more blue embroidery. Let me do that. And then I'll notice later that that actually really meant something in the work. Adding to diary quilt can also be very thoughtful and very considered in advance, not a whim and not about convenience. And then one of the things that as we were working on this book, the exhibition catalog for Soft Magic, I got to talk with Emily Schlimowitz, the curator, about this idea of verbing that I also learned when I was a student at the Art Institute of Chicago in class with Amy Vogel. And she was trying to emphasize to us the idea that you could draw a picture of water in a cup, in a lake, or you could draw water, the verb. And what we did in class is we put some water on a piece of paper. We had to invent this, so she didn't have all the students do it, but me and my teammate put some water on a piece of paper, and then we traced around the edge of the water as it seeped deeper into the paper, and the space that the water was taking up expanded. And then the paper got all wrinkled because it had been wet, and that was part of the art and the exercise. And so for me, creating a microcosm in a quilt where I get to think about, what do I want to do in the big wide world, right? I want to say yes to my big important goal. How can I practice saying yes to my big important goal in cloth, in fabric? How can, as I stitch that, it reinforces the idea of what I want? And for example, if I want to put like with like when I'm tidying up my home studio, I can also be putting like with like, or even tidying up on the quilt. And I can ask myself, what does that look like to tidy up my things, to organize the space on a quilt, and then strengthen those neural pathways? This is an example of a calendar quilt that at the Pfister, folks did not see it till I told them about it. But this is January up here, March, February, etc. And this is 2021. 21 was a very special, lucky, wonderful year to be me. And I wanted to invite more of that. And I also wanted to find out, why was it such a great year? So I went back through my calendar and I took note of when I was teaching live in person, when I was traveling, different things about my health. And so here I was able to learn a lot on things like this day when I filmed my first on-demand class for my website, or here in November when I circled having an actual shop on my website where you could buy art from me instead of needing to send an email. So here are some more of my diary quilts. This one I added to every day for 100 days during the pandemic. And this was sparked from a conversation that I had with my therapist, who was trying to cognitively reframe for all of us what was going on, and saying, we're part of a historical moment, the same way that we're looking back at the influenza in the 1918. People will one day look back at this time and they'll wonder what it was like. And I thought, let me make a quilt about what it was like and add a little bit every day and see what I have time for. And for example, here, just the surprise that the chives were blooming in my garden, and that time was indeed passing along and not at a standstill. The filling up of this quilt was irrefutable proof that time was passing, that I was not in a time warp. And it was a very helpful quilt for me to be making in 2020 that truly was a launching pad for this idea of diary quilting. This is the first time that I put a calendar on a quilt. It's a quilt that I made about my cycle. I was having a lot of health problems at the time, and this quilt is Magical Thinking Attempt number 1. And this, for example, is Magical Thinking Attempt number 8. So the series evolved throughout working on it to manifest lots of things like my health, but also relationships and new ways of being, things I wanted to remember to do. This quilt is a scrap quilt, just about like, how can I be closer to zero waste. And how can I manifest and practice that? This is Magical Thinking attempt number 10, the most recent in the series. This quilt would be at Quilt National. This is the one where I was tidying up my studio and putting like with like, and also trying to remind myself that even though I was visiting my mom in Florida, I still needed to do my occupational therapy to keep my arm in good health. I do a fair amount of hand yoga, and I share about that on YouTube as well. This is Magical Thinking attempt number 9. And then this last video is of the Soft Magic exhibition. So those are some receipts that I crocheted around in class with Ann Wilson, my first fabric quilt. And then this photo here is my first ever quilt that I ever made in metalworking class at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. So if you're wondering how I became who I am, a big part of it is this very first quilt and that origin story around working with photographs. You can see lots of pictures, right? This young man was my first kiss. I put him in the quilt. And there's fabric. These are even little bits of my baby quilt, and my fabric from my baby quilt has shown up in quite a few other quilts over the years. And so here, I hope you notice a theme. If you are looking for me anywhere on the internet, my name is Heidi Parks, and that is how you can find me. You might want to take a screenshot of this page for ease in finding me. I'm going to be teaching a diary quilting class online. I've just opened up signups. I think it was yesterday was the first day. So class starts in mid-April. It's online. I would love to have you join me and try your hand at diary quilting. And I especially hope, and on the About tab on HeidiParks.com, you can find more about this. I hope that you can attend the Soft Magic exhibition if you are anywhere near the Wisconsin, Milwaukee area. So thank you so much. And then back to Zach.
Sarah, we doing all right on time? Can I do 5 minutes?
Yeah, if you want to do 5 and then we'll take about 5 for questions, I think that's great.
Okay, good. Thank you so much. I appreciate the
I
understanding.
came in a minute over. I was at 16 minutes instead of 15.
You good, Heidi. You good. You good. So it felt really funny when I realized that I'd been kicked off the call and I'd finished my presentation to 3 twin-sized beds here in this room. But the new Apocalypse is a collection of work that is forward-looking, right? If Southern by Amnesia was historically based, the new Apocalypse explores why are we as humans drawn to these narratives of catastrophe? And I realized this impulse in myself a little over a year ago when the Southeastern Quilt and Textile Museum in Georgia reached out to me wanting to do a show. And they're like, can you available in 2025? And I was like, y'all cute. You think we're still going to be here? And it was in that moment, I'm like, dang, even a pragmatic optimist like myself, pragmatic because there's no other choice, truly, even a pragmatic optimist like myself has trouble seeing what the future looks like. So I started developing this body of work. And here's the first one, Collapse, we thought was certain. It's
Zach, we're
positioned as a...
not seeing your screen right now. If you're
Stop.
kind of
What's
screen
going
here.
on? Thank you, Heidi.
Uh-huh. Well, we did see the image that you were showing when you were saying that that you're cute, what you think will be here in 25. So
You did see that one, but then it disappeared?
Yeah. No, we just like we heard that bit because that part was before the collapse we thought was certain. Well, yeah. Now we're seeing it.
Okay. All right. So here's Collapse.
And we heard I think we might have heard the whole bit about that one. And then the next slide we didn't.
You did. Okay. Boop, boop.
Mhm.
You hear me talk about apogee?
Nope.
Okay. Apogee is a beautiful astronomical term that when I heard it, because I like to do crossword puzzles, got a lot of good vowels in it, I realized that not only is it good for crossword puzzles, but it's also good for the human soul because the apogee is the furthest out point in a moon's orbit when it's farthest away from center, before it begins to return to center. And so it's this natural precedent it's giving us for being really far from home, but then turning around and coming back. So this quilt, which bears a striking resemblance to Yes, More Please, right? It's got the roots and that maximalist experiment that Heidi and I conducted. And we see the immortal wisdom of Gloria Gaynor. Let's turn around now. We can do it. Turn around now. Just pick something different. Here's some beautiful details. I could tell you all kinds of stories. Buy me a coffee one day. Gentle comes from Dylan Thomas's poem, Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night. It is a long list of all the tools we have at our disposal when it comes to moving into the future together. We come with our banners and tambourines and vuvuzelas and who knows what's covered up, and cowbells and Bluetooth speakers and pots and pans and all the old songs and 8 billion of us working together moving into the future. Ember, in the heart's deep well, a burning ember still glows undoused. No matter how dark that bottom of the well looks, that thing is there, alive and well, waiting to be kindled by us, bringing it back into daylight. And then last project I'll share, this is the newest one. It's only 2 days old. You might have seen it on Instagram. All hands on kite. It is, ever since I moved to the South, I got really fascinated with porch flag culture. This idea that someone would want to take the building they live in and claim it for an idea by putting a flag out front. Usually the idea is welcome or springtime or something like that. But I got these two off of eBay and I cut letters out of one, stitched them down with the satin stitch on the machine on the other one, and then I debulked it, to use Heidi and I's word. I cut out the back. So it's only one layer thick in any place, right? I love that if we picture the future as a kite, it can be like, imagine what a kite that took 8 billion people to fly would look like, right? Like, how big would it have to be? How colorful could it be? Where would it take us? What would it mean? What would it feel like to have 8 billion hands, 16 billion hands most likely, on a single cord steering the future? Sounds kind of fun to me, actually. So in this body of work, I'll just wrap up with saying that I am trying to present for us new concepts of the future that aren't the ones we tend to gravitate towards, like moss to a flame, right? Almost every world religion has us ending in a fiery or somehow fatal demise. I'm not sure it has to be that way. So let's find out.
I love that.
Well, thank you both so much. I feel like we just have so much to think about, and we have some great questions in the Q&A, so I will just jump into those. Zach, Pamela is requesting that you repeat the affirmation that you gave people at QuiltCon. She still has hers tied on her name tag.
Oh, Pamela, that's beautiful. So at QuiltCon, I had all these little strips of silk fabric that I would tie on people's lanyards. Heidi gave me a crash course in QuiltCon culture, and she's like, you need to bring something for people's lanyards. I said, okay, got you. And so I would tie the strip of silk onto the lanyards and I'd give everybody a blessing. And the blessing always started the same way. And then I'd ad lib a little bit. But the blessing started with, may we make the world we wish to see. There we go. May we make the world we wish to see.
Okay, then I have a question for Heidi. Could you talk a little bit about the quilt from the Roger Kirikov collection? Who chose it and why was it included in Soft Magic?
Yes, I was just seeing that question and trying to find it on the International Quilt Museum website. I couldn't quite find it yet, but it is there. And that quilt, I I I I love having exposed knots on my quilts, not on every knot, not on every quilt, but on a lot of them. And I was inspired to do that by a Gee's Bend quilt, by the work clothes quilt by Rachel Carey George that is at the Milwaukee Art Museum, because that's my local place to go see things. And the exposed knots on there just made, I ruminated about it for about 2 years before I finally plucked up the courage to have a good occasion to leave an exposed knot. And I deeply wanted a quilt like that in the show. And then I also, over the years, have had such a wonderful relationship with Roderick Kirikoff. I've gotten to see him in person. I got to show him my quilts in person. He's purchased some work from me. And his book, Unconventional and Unexpected, truly meant a lot for expanding my thinking beyond, like, oh, only the quilts of Gee's Bend can be this way. But actually, there are a lot of quilts in America, and there's a really big, beautiful tradition of making quilts that are improvisational. And so this quilt has those exposed knots, and it has this beautiful rhythm in it. And that's why it was so exciting to, and also the International Quilt Museum so generously flew the quilt to us in person. And it's not always easy to get a really famous, really special quilt loaned to you. So the incredible generosity of both Roderick and IQM is another part of why this quilt is in the show.
I pulled it up on, oops.
That's the one.
Yes, on here. I'll just zoom in a little so you can see the quilting a little bit better.
Sarah, do you have the title handy? And I know that we have a good guess at who the maker is.
Let's see.
While Sarah's looking, I'll say, Heidi, you were the one that turned me on to exposed knots, which was my first foray into texture and quilts. So I'm always very thankful for that.
Okay, Roderick's answering us here. String
X. It's one of these bookmarked ones from his book. So it is String X, attributed to Maggie Townsend. And it's incredible. He talked about it beautifully when he was a guest on Textile Talks as well. And Zach, you were talking about texture.
Yeah, just that you brought loose ends or exposed knots into my life, and that was my first little like dip a pinky toe into texture with quilts. Until then, I've been doing a lot of like machine sewn improv patchwork. So that little thing just set me on a whole different course in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And I think I've set a lot of people like on fire for knots. And it was just essential to me to have a quilt in the show that I could point to say, this is why I did it. Yeah, I didn't invent it, pull it out of the clear blue sky. It's from these incredible quilts from a generation or two before us. And so I'm so grateful that we were able to include that aspect of it in the show. To look forward, look back, and look to the future. And that's part of the Soft Magic exhibition, with having quilts from my teachers and inspirations, collaborations with peers, and then there's also a lot of work from my students in the exhibition. And I'm so proud of them and so excited that a lot of them are flying out to the show this weekend.
Wish I could be there.
Oh no. You'll come in June. That's your time to be in Milwaukee.
That's right.
Anyways.
I'm gonna send CJ your way. She'll be my representative, my ambassador.
Sarah, have you got the next question?
Yes, let's see. Someone is asking if you two can be invited back because they need more time.
Yes, more please.
More please.
And then finally, this is kind of a big question. In light of, I believe this was asked to Zach during your Southern White Amnesia section. What can we do as a nation to prevent history from being rewritten and whitewashed, for example, in education?
Document. Tell your stories. Get your stories out there. Bear witness. We got to be archivist of what we see happening, so the future has something to point back to.
That's great. Okay, I
And
think that
just
is all.
to add to that very recent question, I am popping in the chat right now the playlist for a series that Zach and I have done on YouTube called Soft Bulk. We did Soft Bulk with Luke Haynes and lots of guest speakers, including Roderick. So there are 23 episodes. So if you are curious for more of Heidi and Zach, it is out there ready for you. You don't even need to wait.
That's right. And I got a lot of quilt talks that I do on my podcast Seam Side. So if you want to hear the extended version of a lot of the Southern White Amnesia quilts specifically, I would encourage you to go check out Seam Side and you'll find entire episodes devoted to single quilts.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much. And I hope you can all join us next week for Dr. Mazlumi.
Yeah. Y'all are in for a
Thank you.
treat.
Yeah, thank you, Zach and Heidi. It was wonderful to talk with you today.
Thank you.
Anytime.